Hello, my name is Angelina Okuda-Jacobs. I am a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina. I grew up in the gardens of my mother and my grandmother and have spent my life caring for plants and examining how our traditional native foods impact our diet, our health, and our culture as Native people. I'm so grateful that these are being explored and put forward in the new documentary film, Gather. I'm really excited to be here today as the moderator to facilitate a conversation with the creators of Gather. And I want to also thank all of you for watching Gather as part of the 33rd Annual Virginia Film Festival. I'm here today with the director of Gather, Sanjay Rawal, as well as Danielle Hill, who is a member of the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe of Massachusetts, and who is one of the featured participants in the film. First, I'd like to take my moderator hat off and put my fan hat on. Sanjay, Danielle, the film is extraordinary. It's beautifully shot, and Sanjay, you do such a wonderful job of sharing these individual stories and weaving them together into a cohesive picture of how traditional indigenous foods connect people to place and have impacts across culture, across language, health, and even historical trauma. So thank you for taking on this project and making this beautiful film. So let's start with Sanjay, if we could. And let's start at the beginning. I'm just wondering how you got started with this project.
That's a great question, Angelina. Thank you. And thank you, Danielle, and everyone for joining us today. I worked in human rights for about 15 years and made my first full-length film in 2014 called Food Chains. And it looked at the food system. It looked at a group of migrant farm workers in southern Florida called the Coalition of Immokalee Workers. They live on Seminole land, and they have been incredibly successful in pressuring really large buyers of the produce they pick to enforce human rights statutes and to pay fair wages down the supply chain. As it happens, we look at them, superficially as all being from Mexico or all being Latino, but they're in fact displaced indigenous from Oaxaca, Chiapas, and Guatemala. And so I got a real inside look into indigeneity in the agricultural system in a way that I hadn't before. The principles of their organizing, the care that they put into even in backbreaking work in the supply chain, picking tomatoes, had a spirit that reminded me of my dad's village in India. I made a subsequent film that featured some Native American runners, but in 2017, I was approached by the First Nations Development Institute, a premier nonprofit out of Longmont, Colorado, to see if we might be able to partner together on a film about Native American food sovereignty. It's a deep and sacred subject that I am nowhere near an expert or even proficient in, but they connected me to wonderful people like Danielle and assured me that they would stand by my side and help me prevent the types of mistakes that most non-natives make in making films about North American Native Americans.
So what would you say you're hoping to achieve through this film? What would you like the watchers of this film to get out of it and to do after they see the film?
That's another great question. I mean, we primarily made this film for Indian country, for Native Americans who are still feeling the brunt of 400 plus years of colonization, the destruction of those food systems, and where the act of food sovereignty isn't a weekend activity. It's not like going to a farmer's market or going to Whole Foods or picking out what you want to have for takeout. It's survival. It's trying to stop the effects of a long-term genocide that's now manifesting as diabetes and other chronic diet-related diseases. So first and foremost, we're hoping that people in Indian country and organizations like yours, Angelina, can use the movie to inspire constituents, to inspire brothers and sisters on how to work together to rebuild those community food systems. But for those outside of Indian country, it's simple. It's like, look at your local policies, look at federal food system policies, and support Native peoples in their fight for equity so that they can discard the yoke of, again, hundreds of years of terrible federal and state policy. On a simple level, when you go to a farmer's market, chances are there's an indigenous producer there, whether they are from the contiguous United States or whether they have an indigenous background from Oaxaca or Chiapas or Guatemala or Latin America. Learn to find products within your own supply chains and within stores you go to, from big ones like Tonka Bar to Native American coffee producers, and begin really putting your dollars where your heart might be.
Well, that's wonderful. You know, I don't know of any film like this that's been done on this kind of scale across the country and across so many different Native communities, looking at foods and the systems of foods and how it really crosses all facets of life. And I think that from the Native perspective, it's going to be a fabulous tool to really inspire a lot of people who maybe haven't thought as much. You know, the history and the current use of commodities is pervasive throughout Indian country. And there is this movement to think more about our relationship with plants, our relationship with animals, relationship with our foods. But I think sometimes a vehicle like film and what you've done here will help build that spark that I think across Indian country we really desperately need, because unfortunately it's not, you know, there's so many emergencies across Indian country that have to be addressed on a day-to-day basis, that it still is not at the forefront every day, these issues, even though you eat every day. So I'm really grateful for this work, and I'm really excited to see, you know, where it goes and what impact that it has, because I'm sure that it will have a tremendous impact and build greater and greater support for these efforts. So thank you. I'm going to ask you both about politics in a second, which I know is kind of the P word these days. But I'd first like to talk a little bit with both of you about the importance of food systems in Indian communities in terms of identity, language, culture. And Sanjay, if you can kind of start a little bit with that in terms of what you saw in the participants that were in the film. You know, what did they share with you in terms of the centrality of food to culture, to language, and to place?
I'll keep my answer really short because Danielle is an absolute expert on this. My experiences are really framed by those of my parents from India. They grew up in villages that have existed for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And they just shed British colonization in 1947. So I still have the chance to see and to understand what the pre-colonial diet was like, because I just have to ask them if they remember what was in the pantries of their grandparents. Their grandparents would have been born in the 1820s, 1810s, in areas of India that hadn't had colonized food systems yet. And I see how different that is. At the same time, I see how critical our foods in India are for ceremonies and how those foods carry medicinal value, even, you know, in the US. And by really approaching this topic through that lens of my own family's experience of colonization and diet, I was able to at least, I think, listen with a full heart or open heart to the characters in the film.
Mm-hmm. And Danielle, can you also speak to this a little bit about how food sovereignty and food security has impacted your community at Mashpee?
Yes, this is such a good question. And it's very multifaceted. So I believe through my work so far that food sovereignty can be examined through about 5 different lenses. So we have the agricultural lens, we have the spiritual lens, the cultural lens, we have the political lens, and we have the societal and economic lens. And at some point in time, they all overlap. But the most important piece that I found with food sovereignty is this idea that the plant and animal beings have to be freed from this notion of commodity and food. Once we start to just understand that these beings have a relationship to the land and to the waters, and when we ingest them, then it deepens our connection with them and to the land. So food sovereignty is like, you know, if you break down the word, it's food and it's freedom. And so it's freedom from this slavery that I feel like the plants and the animals are in, and they're just for consumption. So once we sort of break that down and erase that from our minds, then we can start to understand the relationship that we as individuals and human beings have with these plants, with these animals, and our role in taking care of them. So to me, that's the basis, and that will help everybody understand, well, then how do you acquire land to then, you know, to work the agricultural piece, just having space to grow out these plants and animal beings so they can continue their evolution. How do you then talk to your local political bodies about, number one, preserving those land spaces, but also number two, respecting the, you know, the Aboriginal hunting and fishing rights that the Native people have? After that, how do you then, as an individual, understand how our ancestors viewed these plants and animal beings through the language? What are the words that they used? How do they conceptualize their interconnectedness with these plants and animals? So to me, it's just erasing this idea of just food for taste, food for consumption, food for pleasure. It's about the plants and the animals and the human interconnectedness and their relationship to one another. So that to me is the foundation. Number two, I would just say different tribes and tribal people are becoming aware that their role is not just to consume, it's not just to eat, but it's to preserve, and it's to understand, and it's to continue to protect these plants and these animals. And that's what we're doing here in Mashpee. We have been on these lands, we have never been removed. So we have a really deep-rooted connection and deep-rooted memory of our place here in Mashpee. So I would just say that, you know, here in Mashpee, we're doing our role just to continue to fight for the protection of these plants and these animals.
Thank you for that. I think that's a really important part of this this story and this effort. It reminds me of a lot of the things that I was raised with in terms of looking at it as a responsibility that we have as humans as part of that ecosystem, and that we have responsibilities to those plants and those animals. You know, corn exists because we helped corn to be. and we were part of corn's story. And if you look across the different nations across the country, corn is very different in different places, and the people are different in different places, and they have a different relationship. And a lot of it is that spiritual connection that you talked about. It's also a scientific connection, to the extent that you've got dryland farming at Hopi, for example, where the corn and Hopi people live in desert. And then you have Three Sisters on the East Coast that have a synergy relationship that allows corn to look and exist in a very different way. And it's our responsibility in those communities to make sure that we do our part so that those plants can exist in a way that they are supposed to. And if those responsibilities are maintained, then that the medicinal properties that you mentioned, that comes through as well. That healing properties come through, and the emotional healing as well. You feel that connection that you just are not going to feel if you're opening up a commodity box. You're just not. So I thank you for that, and it's always I think good to hear that across Indian country, and that those efforts are being recognized and implemented. So what I wanted to also talk a little bit about is kind of the political side of food sovereignty, and how the displacement of our traditional food systems implicates the political relationship that tribes have with the United States, and how questions of access to traditional food systems becomes a political question. And that's happened in every corner of Indian country. And I was just wondering if Danielle, if you have any experience with that, or Sanjay, in your conversations with the participants, if they shared any of those stories with you as well.
Well, number one, I just want to set the tone for this and just say it's absolutely ridiculous to block access to food. I mean, food for any human being anywhere in the world, that is our right. And that is what we need to live and to survive. We, as Mashpee Wampanoag people, we have always maintained our Aboriginal hunting, fishing, and gathering rights. And this right was acknowledged by the colonists, that this was something that allowed us to continue to live. It was a fabric of our culture. The practices were ingrained in us, spiritually and emotionally, and this was honored. This should be acknowledged throughout Indian country by non-natives, that Native American people may not want to adopt and subscribe to mainstream food production and food economies. It's not a part of who we are. We can see that through the health disparities that have been affecting us. So what do? We should allow Native communities the right to access waterways, the right to go onto lands on and off their reservations, to gather, to hunt, to plant. That is who we are, and that should never be disturbed or obstructed or taken away. Here on the East Coast, many of our tribal members are, we're big agriculturalists. So we live right here on the East Coast on the water. And so we're fishermen and fisherwomen. And so going to the bays and, fishing and shellfishing is daily culture. I mean, that's what we are. We crave that seawater. We crave those beings, and we eat them lovingly, and we take care of the waterways. And so many people who don't understand our relationship to the water, they complain and they call the police, and they're not informed or educated or even willing to educate themselves on why this is important to us and why this is not necessarily just an arbitrary privilege that, oh, the Indians get to go and they get to fish, without a license, or they sort of reduce it down to this idea of, discrimination, like they're not getting something that we have. Whereas it's just our right to continue to feed ourselves. And we're constantly dealing with unnecessary court cases, unnecessary police brutality, unnecessary, arrests. And it's just because our neighbors who are non-native just don't understand that this is a part of our culture and it should just be honored. And so we have the ability to access any waterways, whether it's on private land or reservation land or off reservation land. And that should just be respected. And I know a lot of other tribes are facing the threat of these inherent rights to be taken away or challenged. And it just exhausts all of our energy. And we just ask that, our neighbors educate themselves and just liberate themselves from this idea of, scarcity. There really is enough for everybody, so that's what we're fighting with here in Mashpee.
And I think it's important as well for viewers to understand the corollary between Native American movements for sovereignty and what more people know about these days in Black Lives Matter. I mean, when the continent was first colonized by Europeans, we weren't in the Industrial Revolution. The economy was completely topsoil based, although there was a little bit of hunting here and there. And the Native Americans were impediments to the expansion of the American economy because they occupied land. They farmed land. They cultivated wide areas of forests for animals, for plants, for other beings. Africans were brought to this country for their bodies, and you can see the legacy of that institutional racism as it plays out in terms of policing the African-American body. With Native Americans, the push from the colonial government and now the federal government is always to take possession of their land. So there's a series of hundreds of policies that effectively attempt to strip natives of their access to land, of their rights to land. And even if those rights are treaty bound, state representatives of the government and policing system will try their best to intimidate Native tribes and Native individuals to relinquish those access rights.
Yeah, that you're right, that it's still happening every day throughout Indian country, but beyond Indian country, you very rarely hear about it. And I think it goes to the bigger questions of our continued invisibility in the United States. And we still fight with this every day to have these issues just recognize that this is the life that we're living every day. And I think your point and your comparison to Black Lives Matter is very appropriate. Even with the greater visibility that they have, we all know the struggle that the African American community has in getting the reality of what they face day to day in terms of their relationship with the police and how they are treated. And it's just now starting to sink in, and people are starting to recognize that, but it's taken decades and decades and decades of that active work to get that recognized.
I don't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to push something at Danielle, because she said it so eloquently. I think it's difficult for people who are non-Native to understand the role of stewardship that Native Americans played to steward and protect and preserve the entire environment of Turtle Island. I mean, we see in California with the erasure of Native peoples there, that the traditional fire suppression measures haven't been taken seriously for decades. And climate change, of course, is real, but we know a lot of those things could and should be mitigated by indigenous techniques.
Yeah. Yeah, and one of the most wonderful examples in terms of forestry management is that Menominee tribe in Wisconsin. And they have a completely sustainable forest that they have been living in and managing forever. And they have an active logging company as part of their tribe because they use techniques that they have been using in a traditional way, a spiritual way, economic way forever. And if you ever go to visit Menominee, it's you come up to the res and it's like driving up to a wall of woods, and it's farmland, and then it's just an absolute line of woods that comes up immediately as you cross into the reservation. And it's a very healthy forest system, and they have been using their traditional techniques to manage it. And so, yes, you know, there's so much that tribes and indigenous peoples could assist these efforts with, but again, just we are not seen as scientific people. I think if you look at and you touched on this in the film a little bit about the legacy of boarding schools, our knowledge was not seen as useful. Instead, it was seen as a hindrance.
We see it everywhere now. It's like these terms like regenerative farming, permaculture. These are all from indigenous scientists, you know, corn, yeah, potatoes, tomatoes, chocolate, cassava, avocados, a lot of beans, pineapples. These all came from native science. So, you know, obviously it's like we're all struggling to have natives at the table. But the necessary step is to have natives lead the movement for environmental sustainability, because everyone else has failed.
Yeah. So just a couple more questions I would like to touch on. One of another area that I saw very prominent in the film was the relationship with the youth, and having the youth involved in food systems and sharing that knowledge from elders and community leaders to the youth to continue the life of that knowledge. Can either of you talk a little bit about that in terms of the importance of sharing this knowledge between elders and youth?
Yes, it's very necessary. I mean, you need the wisdom of the elders. You need their knowledge base, their memory, their direct connection. You need that timeline that they have inside of them, because time is always changing, and they have to download the youth with what life was like, what they experienced, in order for the youth of today to get a holistic understanding of the importance of these preservation activities that many of the youth are being, you know, involved in and attracted to. You need both to work together. Like their energy is its own synergistic, you know, combustion. You need both. Without it, it would be imbalanced. Any activity that just comes from the youth and what they think would be imbalanced, any activity that comes from just the elders or another demographic would just be imbalanced. You need all the perspectives in order to bring something into fruition that would be impactful and sustainable, essentially. I would just suggest, though, that the youth, you know, embody some level of humility and some level of patience. I feel like the younger people are, the faster they attempt to accomplish things, and they just need to slow down a little bit and listen to the rest of the tribal community. They can't get everything done on their own. But what is good is that when they do set their minds to certain things, they can accomplish a lot, and they are the future, you know. So it's important that the elders relinquish some of their protectiveness and willfully give it to the youth to just carry that baton forward, rather than sort of holding on to these traditions or certain knowledge, you know, ideas, just out of fear that it won't be accomplished. So I would just say that, you know, our youth, we have a youth council here. They're extremely active, but they are autonomous from our tribal council, which is important and enables them to actually succeed and get things done without the bureaucracy or the limitations of the tribal council. So that's important.
I'm just wondering if there's any youth or youth councils and other tribes or community members who are interested in starting a program or a project to reinvigorate their relationship with their traditional foodways. Do you have any thoughts about how they could go about doing that?
Yes. Well, I think the beauty of these times is that everyone is intimately connected in the virtual world and on social media. And rather than working in silos, it would be really nice to see a youth, you know, a Indian country youth coalition, some sort of larger organization, a nonprofit organization that would just kind of harness all the smaller efforts that youth are doing on their own reses in their own communities, and uplift those ideas and those dreams, help fund those ideas and those activities, and allow them just to be separate from their tribal governments, but allow them to sort of access autonomous funding, allow them to you know, partner with other organizations that are working to advance food sovereignty in Indian country. But there should be a youth specific group that would just oversee, or just not even oversee, just help these different communities succeed. It's sometimes here in our community, the youth have such good ideas, but they need help mobilizing the rest of the community. They need help, you know, with advocacy. They need help with, you know, acquiring certain assets, whether it be, you know, smaller pieces of land that they may want to farm on, or grants. So it would be nice if they could tap into other like-minded individuals in Indian country to help them do that.
Sanjay, do you have any final thoughts that you would like to share about youth or about the participants in the film, or the film in general, Native food systems?
I'm just grateful that, you know, I had the chance to spend so much time with people like Danielle that are really on the front lines, to get to meet people like you that are really on the front lines. You know, most of us don't realize how much of the future of our food system depends on a reinvigoration of indigenous foodways in Indian country first. You guys have the knowledge, you guys have the background in shepherding and stewarding this massive piece of land called Turtle Island. There's obviously a lot of impacts that colonization has had in Indian country, but I'm just grateful to see that the wisdom's not only still there, but the willingness and the energy and the dynamism and the positivity is all still there. So I look forward to watching you guys push the movement forward, and hopefully one of these days having a great meal together again.
Yes, yeah, that would be wonderful. Boy, one of these days we'll get there, hopefully sooner rather than later. All right, well, I think to wrap up, I want to thank both of the panelists for being here and for this wonderful discussion about Native foodways. I would also like to thank all of the elders and the community members, the youth in the film, all who helped behind the scenes to bring Gather into being, and for all of you at home for watching and supporting this beautiful and important film, Gather. So please Be safe and be well. And thank you all so much.